in this wonderful facility. And so for those who don't know, my name is Mackenzie Shuman. I am an environmental reporter at the Tribune in San Luis Obispo. I've been covering offshore wind and the port infrastructure studies that have come out since they've been coming out for the past couple of years. And so before I introduce our panelists, I do actually want to get to begin with a quick presentation on the proposed floating offshore wind energy development coming to the Pacific Ocean near us, just so we're all starting at kind of a baseline of information. So if you can please move to the next slide. Ready? Okay, and the next slide after that. So first, we're going to go over some terms that you guys might hear tonight. To start off, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, they're the federal agency within the Department of the Interior that's responsible for managing the development of our offshore resources. This includes oil, gas, and renewable energy. A wind energy area, or a WEA, is an area that BOEM has determined is potentially suitable for commercial wind energy development. The Morro Bay Wind Energy Area is the area where BOEM has determined offshore wind can be developed on the Central Coast. It carries the Morro Bay name, but it's actually closer to Cambria and San Simeon, for those who are familiar. Next slide. Yeah. So let's take a little bit closer look at the Morro Bay Wind Energy Area. You can see it outlined in black there on the map. It encompasses 376 square miles. That's about 240,640 acres. So it's a pretty massive area. The closest point to the shore is about 20 miles off Cambria's coast. The turbines, if built, would be in water about 900 to 1,300 meters deep. The federal government has long said the area, if fully built out, could generate about 3 gigawatts of electricity. The companies who have won the 3 leases to build out the area, they say they can generate about double that, so about 6 gigawatts of electricity. For context, Diablo Canyon is 2,200 megawatts, so it's a little bit different. Next slide, please. So an auction in December generated about $425.6 million for the 3 lease areas available in the Morro Bay Wind Energy Area. The other area that you see there in the top map, that's the Humboldt Wind Energy Area off Humboldt Bay. This was the first ever auction for offshore wind energy on the West Coast. There are a few areas leased or up for lease on the East Coast as well. So where we are now in the process of getting floating wind turbines in the ocean, it's still pretty early. The red arrow there, if you can click again. That's where we are. So we just had the auction. BOEM is working on finalizing the leases that they're giving to the companies. And then after that, as you can see, we're now at pre-survey meetings. There's lots of site assessment plans, environmental review processes that still need to happen before actual construction plans are submitted. And during this whole process, there will be more opportunities for public engagement like this potentially, and so forth. And then, let's see. So California has a goal of getting 2 to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind energy operational by 2035 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. So we do have targets that the state and federal government are looking to meet somewhere along this timeline. So there's a lot of support for bringing offshore wind to the Central Coast. Some of the primary reasons include helping keep the state and country reach clean energy targets, like I mentioned before, and providing the Central Coast with long-term jobs and revenue. There's also plenty of opposition. For example, fishermen are worried about the turbines' impact on their fishing grounds. Environmental groups wonder about the impacts on birds, whales, fish, bats, and other marine life. And many Cambria and San Simeon residents worry about their views, of course. There are many factors that will contribute to the offshore wind energy industry. being able to establish itself on our coast. Obviously, so there's a few of them. What we're going to discuss tonight is primarily the port infrastructure that could be needed along our coast or along California's coast. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So to my immediate left is Senator John Laird. He was elected to the California State Senate in 2020 to represent District 17 after serving as Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency under Governor Jerry Brown. In the State Senate, Senator Laird serves on multiple committees. One of those is the Committee on Natural Resources and Water. And then next to him, we have Jennifer Mattox. She held a 30-year career as a scientist with the state of California. She serves as the manager of the State Lands Commission's Climate Adaptation and Special Initiatives team, where she's responsible for statewide policy development and interagency coordination in areas including climate change and coastal erosion. Mattox is also the lead staff member coordinating a multidisciplinary team for the Commission's offshore wind planning and implementation activities. And then next to Jennifer, we have Joshua Boswell. He leads the offshore wind engagement for REACH, Central Coast, in his role as Vice President of Policy and Economic Development. Before coming to the Central Coast, Josh worked in Washington, D.C., advising the world's top companies on investment, workforce, supply chain, and partnership decisions, and navigating the complexities of government policy, global markets, and multi-stakeholder initiatives. With that, we will begin our question and answer. How this is going to work is I will ask several questions of our panelists, and then at the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll have an opportunity to ask your questions. So I think if you wanted to, you were given a note card on the entrance to here. If you want a note card, you can wave your hand and somebody will give it to you. And so you can write down a question that you may have for our panelists that arises, and then those will get handed up to me and we'll ask those at the end. So with that, I'll start with our first question. This is for Josh. So Josh, there was a study that came out in the fall, in the winter, from REACH about port infrastructure. And I'm curious, can you, for the audience, describe the purpose of that study that came out and broadly what did it find?
Sure, thank you, Mackenzie, and good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
No.
Good. That's a good way to start.
Is that better?
Yes.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Good to be with everyone this evening. So thank you for the question. So REACH is a nonprofit organization. We were founded several years ago, recognizing that here on the Central Coast, we face a number of economic challenges. Right, cost of living is high. Certainly pre-COVID, most jobs paid less than $50,000 per year. A lot of major employers, including at Diablo Canyon, are closing or slated for closure in the coming years. And so for us, thinking about in the future economic fabric of this region, if this is going to be a place where folks can stay and have to leave to find opportunity, or can stay and find opportunity and stay and raise their own families, offshore wind is simply part of that broader conversation. And so we started out a couple of years ago looking at potential economic impacts of offshore wind from a jobs perspective. Based upon some of that work and recognizing that a lot of the economic impact of jobs with this new industry are associated with the infrastructure, the waterfront infrastructure. There was interest in this county, the city, and in the county of Santa Barbara south of here to do a joint study, really looking at the opportunities for waterfront infrastructure across two different industries, across offshore wind and across the commercial space industry down at Vandenberg Space Force Base. So this is a project that REACH project managed in partnership with those three entities. We hired an engineering firm that has done really exemplary work across the West Coast, in particular around offshore wind, that authored the study, and really ultimately came out with a menu of different options, about a dozen different sites across this two-county region that could potentially provide different types of support for these two different industries. And again, the goal and the intent all along was simply to provide that menu of options. This was not in any way a study to recommend certain sites or certain projects, really just enable this region to kick the tires, do its own homework, and better understand what are those possibilities as we look to the future and as these processes move forward at state and federal levels.
Josh, if you can kind of add on to that. So the study looked specifically at the feasibility of constructing kind of huge ports that were reported on. These cover 70 to 100 acres of the ocean in places that we know, like Port San Luis and off the coast of Diablo Canyon. How come those places were selected in the study for those ports?
Yeah, great question. So the study looked at two different types of options, specifically for offshore wind, smaller scale activities and facilities and larger scale facilities and activities. Smaller scale being those sites that are simply supporting the vessels that are moving back and forth to the wind farms, bringing people and equipment. The study authors looked at all the different existing infrastructure sites on the Central Coast, including places like Morro Bay. Really tried to analyze what sites could potentially support those smaller scale activities with certain upgrades and investments. Honed in into about 6 different sites that could possibly serve those different types of smaller activities. For the larger scale facilities, these are the sites that are actually going to assemble or repair the turbines, the actual windmills themselves. We did an analysis very aligned with what the State Lands Commission did in terms of looking at the 2 counties' coastline, using criteria to remove areas where we have parks, residential areas, airspace restrictions, etc., to really hone in on 6 different possible sites for those larger scale activities to take place. Based on the guidance from our steering committee, and this is one kind of slight distinction between what the State Lands Commission did, we did a double click into the 2 sites that have existing waterfront infrastructure, so Diablo Canyon and Port St. Louis, as you identified. Again, the purpose of all of these different sites that were identified was not to recommend one site over another, really just to provide that full menu of options so that hopefully the Central Coast, thinking through the role we want to play or potentially could play in offshore wind, what is the right landing zone? We need to know the information first to be able to make those types of choices. The goal of this study was to lay out all of those different options.
Thank you. And Jennifer, kind of adding on to that, so the State Lands Commission came out in February analyzing the port needs along our coast. What did it find? How did it differ from REACH's study at all?
Well, first I just want to say thank you all for coming. I mean, this is really wonderful. And, you know, I like to joke sometimes about like, well, I spent 12 hours in the car for a 1-hour meeting. That was a cool time. But in all honesty, this is a place that I've been coming for probably over 12, 13 years now. And every time I come down, I learn something. And every time I come down, I take something back with me to my colleagues and others that I work with in the community up there who are trying to work on these difficult issues. So I think probably what I would say about what we're calling the alternative ports assessment study in terms of how it came to be, it actually isn't as like blockbuster as you might think. There was just a lot of interest at the beginnings of last year. There was a lot of interest in like, you know, do we need a new port? Can we do it with what we have? Do we need something new? What do we do? We need to know. We need to know, and we need to know now. And so based on that interest in doing sort of fatal flaw screening, we obliged. And fortunately for us, the Energy Commission had some money laying around, and they were able to fund this study. You know how scientists like to study things to literal death. So we contracted with an engineering firm called Moffitt & Nichol, and they pulled this study together. And I just want to sort of make it really clear that we consider the study that was done by our contractor to be like an input study. It's sort of it's something that you can compare the other stuff to. So what they did was they used sort of their desktop analyses. We came up with a set of criteria that we all agreed on. They interviewed a lot of waterfront operators, and they interviewed some industries. So they had some things. They said, well, for these functions, we need this much space. For these functions, we need this much space. And then we kind of applied those criteria to various locations along the coast between San Francisco and Port of Los Angeles. And they came up with a long list, and then they applied additional screens and came up with a short list. So the purpose of that was just to understand, what are we talking about here when we compare? So if you're saying, let's do it in an existing port, here's how much it costs to upgrade it, versus here's how much it costs to make a new one. We want to have something to compare it to. So it's really important to be really clear. There is no proposal, there is no approval, there is no permit on the ground. It's just all about trying to get our full bearings and understand all the trade-offs before recommending anything.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for clarifying that. And can you kind of add on to that? And in the State Lands Commission study, I understand, kind of going off what Josh was saying earlier, that there were specific ports that were mentioned of what was potentially needed in the state. Can you describe those a little bit for us? And I just also want to remind you to get close to the mic, please.
So are you asking about what types of activities necessitate different type of port facilities?
Yeah, and what type of ports those would, yeah.
Yeah, so the two main functions that our report looked at were called staging and integration. That's where they put all the pieces together and then put it away. There are some issues, you know, for navigation, for safety, for greenhouse gas emissions. If you're towing a fully assembled turbine, which is about 1,000 feet across and 1,000 feet high, if you're towing that from Seattle or Humboldt or even from LA, there's some navigation issues. So we really looked at the things that really necessitated sort of local, right? So staging and integration requires a larger amount of land on the waterfront and a heavy load bearing, and then a certain water depth. So there were 3 locations that kind of made that quote unquote short list for staging and integration. And they assessed that, and I'm an old lady now, so I put my glasses on. So the 3 were Port San Luis, China Harbor, and Godot Canyon. And these developments would be in about the $2 to $2.5 billion range to develop. So that's a data point, certainly is an interesting piece of information. The other type is operations and maintenance. So these are crew vessels. Well, there's all these acronyms that I didn't write down on my notes, but there are various types of sort of maintenance, crew transfer, hanging out in the ocean to work on some turbines. Those don't require so much space, and there was a longer list of potentially feasible waterfront locations, as well as interest from waterfront operators. And that was one of the things that this study was really careful to do, was to interview everyone and first say, do you even want to? Are you even interested? Or no? Because nobody's going to force anything. So the various locations sort of met all of those criteria. So there was a smaller number of locations that could potentially serve for Cruz and for operations and maintenance. And those might be, they estimated about 1 million to potentially 50 million to develop or redevelop. And so the next step would be to move, you know, some subset forward into a comparative analysis once the studies come out that are not yet completed. So we're sort of waiting on this other piece so that we can make that comparison.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Senator Laird, I'm wondering, after you read the studies from the State Lands Commission and from REACH, what did you think of them? What were some key things that made it stood out to you?
Thank you. And let me first say, it's great to be here. And we had a Senate floor session this morning, and I chaired an education committee hearing afterwards. So I'm just happy to have made it here. And I think it's fair to have just a little context beforehand, because I think, you know, a few years ago, I was exactly where all of you were, which is suddenly this issue was thrust in front of me, and I was a layperson, and I didn't know much about it. And I chaired the Ocean Protection Council, where there's 2 people that were every public comment period at that meeting sitting there. And also as Secretary of Resources, I had the Energy Commission, and they were the point people. And so if you look at what the slide showed, and you're trying to figure out what does it mean to have offshore wind here, it sort of comes in about 4 pieces. You have the leases and you have the turbines out there. And then you have cables and some system to get the power somewhere. And the cables most likely would be on the floor of the ocean, and there would probably be enough power that you have to have a substation. I was was off in Denmark a few weeks ago, and they just had a substation on stilts next to the turbines. And then you have the port, which has the different things that I'll talk about in a minute in response to the question. And then you need transmission, because you need to be able to get whatever power comes out of this into our grid. So it's really the turbines, the electric lines to get it in, the port for various functions, and the transmission. That is the way to sort of look at the different pieces of it. And then to get to the question, I have to say in general, and this might be disconcerting, we know a lot, but there's a lot we don't know yet, because you have to have a specific project, and the specific project will dictate some of these needs. And that's the reason there will be processes, and that's the reason the mayor of Morro Bay wrote me and said, we want to be at the table when that happens. And so this is really at the beginning, with the leases having happened and all these other decisions to be made. Now you get to the question about what to think of these studies. And it's interesting because the studies really represent each level involved. The Boehm study, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, is federal. The State Lands Commission is obviously state. REACH represented a lot of the local entities. And in some ways, the studies were addressing the concerns that each has. The REACH study really focused on ports in San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara County. The other studies were broader because the state and the federal interest is broader, in case there were port options that were broader than just the two counties. And then, as you heard, it really breaks down that that there's a need for a port for three different functions or pieces. And the thing that was helpful to me is to understand a little about the space that is required for each of the three. So if you talk about the staging and integration port, where you really, there's a phrase used as lay down space, and you heard the size of these, you have to lay it down. The staging and integration port requires up to 100 acres and 150 foot wharf length. The medium manufacturing fabrication, which is sort of in the middle of that process, requires up to 10 acres and an 800 foot wharf. And a smaller operations and maintenance site, which would really be once it's up and you're trying to service it while it operates, would require maybe 5 to 10 acres and a 300 foot wharf. So then if you look what each study said, yes, they focused on the money and other things, but I think some of the determinant will be how can each of these ports or potential port handle the space requirements for each of these different things. And that is why Boehm concluded that you could upgrade existing big ports to do this. And they named, I think in their study, let's see where it is here, Humboldt, Los Angeles, and Long Beach. And then for the medium size, they named those three ports, and they added Stockton, Richmond, and San Francisco, for example. And then you get to the smaller ports, and that, or the smaller function, which is the smaller space, up to 10 acres or whatever it is, and that is more likely something that could fit in a San Luis Obispo or Santa Barbara space. And I think I'm talking about the facts of the space and the facts of the process, but if you have the overlay of more political or policy concerns, there are people that are very concerned that there be jobs for people that are at Diablo Canyon that might consider in a similar frame. And in the number that are at Diablo Canyon, the operations and maintenance, which is the more likely to fit here, probably doesn't keep the jobs at that level. It would take a bigger port. And if you have a bigger port, it overwhelms in some ways some of the smaller ports that might be local, because it really requires an excessive amount of laydown space. There's a question about the depth of the port in relation to the wharf. And so thus far, that lays it out. And I know that the county is still looking at the county of San Luis Obispo is still looking at whether they should take a harder look at this. But that's just sort of the basics and how a system would operate, what the three studies sort of address, and where anything would be required for the three different levels of function that would be necessary to support the wind.
Yeah, thank you Pete for that. That was really great. And kind of Jennifer, actually, I'm wondering if we can also move to you and ask, Senator Laird kind of touched on the fact that the smaller port could be perhaps sited in Morro Bay, just given the space and so forth. I'm wondering, can we say with any confidence, given your perspective from the state, that San Luis Obispo County will or will not be home to one of these ports? Is that something that we can say right now?
It's not something we can say right now because there are so many factors. It's, even though it seems like 2030 is already right around the corner, and there are some very aggressive aspirational goals being set forth, but there's a lot of planning. And, I'll just say, Mackenzie, I know you were very good at ordering sort of some of your questions, but I struggle to sort of separate some of these concepts where, is there a possibility for one of the larger staging and integration to happen here? I guess, if somebody wants to throw $2.5 billion at it, sure. But it's not just about amendment, because there are all of this confluence of interests, of impacts, of benefits. There are impacted communities adjacent to Port of Long Beach. And when you think about their proposal for another terminal to service the staging and integration, does that then sort of incrementally increase the pollution burden on those communities in San Pedro? And also, how much does it, how much fuel and air emissions does that put out to tow them farther? So you could say on the one column, there's a benefit to having the staging and integration, which, I say that like the big float out, right? There's a benefit to having that as close as possible to the wind energy area. But there are also impacts. It takes a long time to get a big monster like that out of port, right? And so what happens to our local commerce, our local fishermen, our local users of the area for a 6-hour roll down the ramp and float, and everybody cheers and says, "Bon voyage," right? It takes a long time. So there are potential jobs that could come to this community, but then there are potential displacements. So all of those things are things that are being thought about, and the calculation at the end of the day, I think, will take so many factors into consideration, including local support and local interest and local sort of wherewithal. But it'll also be sort of how do all the pieces fit together in a logical way, rather than just, there are lessons that we've learned from the East Coast where they have more of a backwards approach, where they just said, hey, here's a bunch of money, who wants to do a port? And people said, we do, and then they built it, and then the industry came in and said, that's a really tough breakwater to get around, and we can't really use this area after a bunch of money had been invested. So there's just a lot to think about. So that's my non-answer. I feel like it.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I appreciate it. And Senator Laird, bouncing back to you, there was a REACH study, which I hope Josh can also touch on later, that was released a while ago that suggested in order for SLO County to reap the greatest economic benefit from the offshore wind industry, it would need to have one of those massive ports that you guys were talking about earlier, with the siding and integration and so forth. It seems like given space. We don't know if it's gonna come, we don't know about the environmental impacts of that. If it seems as though one of those ports physically and financially cannot come to SLO County, why should we support offshore wind coming to our water?
Well, it's a given that the larger the port would be, the more jobs there would be. It's a question of whether it's actually fit or whether it's actually possible to do. And I don't concede anything yet, although it is really logical that the smaller operations and maintenance, you know, might be something because it's smaller in footprint and that would work here. And for two reasons, it makes sense still, regardless of all that, to support the wind. And the first one, it is just what happened here last September in California. You know, we had just gotten done having a big animated discussion in the legislature about whether to extend the life of Diablo Canyon. And the governor's argument was that there isn't enough energy on certain hot September days to keep the grid from crashing. And then lo and behold, the session adjourns and the next day starts the 10 days that are exactly the textbook case of that. And there were a bunch of things. Diablo Canyon's base load was in evidence during those 10 days and really made a difference. And there was even just every part of everything happened. The battery storage at Moss Landing, and I'll just concede before the questions come that battery storage has its own life here in Morro Bay of concern. But for 2 or 3 hours, battery storage provided more base power onto the grid than Diablo Canyon did at those times. It kept the grid from crashing during that time. And we have to, if you look at the fires that have happened, and San Luis Obispo County dodged the bullet a couple of years ago while I was packed and ready to evacuate in a beautiful coastal seaside foggy town that's a lot like Morro Bay that I never thought a fire would reach. And it happened in Carmel Valley and Big Sur and places that were up and down the region. And then we had the atmospheric rivers and what is happening with climate is extremes. And the best we can do is get off of basic fossil fuels as fast as we can. We need the wind. If we're going to get off fossil fuels, we need things behind it. And I chaired a 12-senator climate working group last year. It was painful. We had 25 meetings. We had 9 stakeholder meetings. We met with local government, business, energy providers, building trades unions, regular unions, environmental groups, environmental justice, and then hashed it out between the senators. And one of the complaints from the building trades union in the very first stakeholder group was, you adopt all these goals, and then a lot of the environmentalists oppose every single project that would help you meet the goal. And then when we had the meeting with the environmentalists, they said, well, they probably have a point. And so it's our job in the most environmentally sensitive way and the way that protects communities to try to figure out how to do this transition. And when you're looking, Mackenzie said the volume of energy that comes from Diablo and other places, wind is one of the biggest sources that can help us replace. We really need it. And in 2021, Jordan Cunningham and I were co-sponsors. Jordan was representing this area at the time. We were co-authors of a thing that said, let's actually drill down on the issues that are environmental, employer, let's set goals for the wind. And that bill passed and was signed, and now we're in the processes to ask those questions and see. And I know there's going to be, and there's lots of other opportunities. I mean, Cuesta College has done training for certain things. Cuesta College would be perfect to do certain trainings for operations and maintenance of wind and add to their programs and other things. But as the rest of the questions are going to get to, I assume, is that there's a lot of unanswered questions, and there's a lot of people that have concerns. And there's a lot of things, whether it's the fishing industry and more pay, or just a whole host of things that have to be made whole, or have to not be affected, or have to be worked into this. And that is the question going forward. Can we have wind, but can we do it in a way that doesn't have some of the impacts that people are most concerned of? And that's why I say we still don't know some things, because we have to see what the project specifically would be. And then we have to see what the mitigations are. And then we have to answer the question about, geez, it can't be mitigated, or some of these can't. And so that's what we're trying to work through. That's the reason why, I mean, this is here tonight. I'm speaking at a workshop. There's a huge panel workshop in Sacramento at the beginning of next week. And I think the Energy Commission is sponsoring it, and you can access it online. So it's something you can sit here and watch the different panels and be able to understand what the answers to the questions.
So that big Sur fire you said, that was started by arson. It wasn't climate change, it was arson.
No, but the question period's later, but I'm actually going to respond to that. Because I was Secretary of Resources during the Paradise Fire, and I was Secretary of Resources during the Tubbs Fire in San Jose.
What are you pointing at me for?
Well, okay, I'll put my hand down, but I'm going to answer your question because you asked it. And the thing about it is there was a fire in 1964 that went from Calistoga to Santa Rosa. It took 2.5 days and it burned 400 houses. There was a fire in 2017 that went, and it took 6 hours. It took 5,000. Regardless of how a fire is ignited, the climate has changed and made the fuel totally different. Paradise went at 60 acres a minute. You could not outrun it. They had done plans on how to evacuate, and they thought they'd do it in segments. They thought they would take time. It went that fast. You could not outrun it. Climate change is here, and it is in effect. We're seeing in fires. We have to deal with trying to figure out how to get some of that carbon out of the air and how to keep these things from happening.
Thank you. You can also write your questions on note cards if you want me to ask them as well. And so kind of bouncing back to the port infrastructure question, at hand, Josh, I'm curious, so from your experience working at Reach, and so forth, is, you know, with the economic question of port siting and where jobs will be located, given which ports are located whether they be in SLO County or LA or Humboldt. If SLO County doesn't get one of the big staging and integration ports, and instead we only have one of the smaller operation and maintenance ports, is that an economic loss to us? What kind of economic impacts would that have on our county?
Sure, it's a really complex question. I think it's a really nuanced issue. I mean, I think we all know offshore wind is coming, right? The federal government has set very aggressive goals. The state has set very aggressive 2030 and 2045 goals. Companies have already put out hundreds of millions of dollars to purchase the lease areas. So for us, I think it gets back to something that Jennifer said, which is what role does this Central Coast region want to play? And what is that local interest to communicate to our state and federal partners in terms of the role that we could or should play in this new ecosystem? And I think at a very simple level, and the senator alluded to this, you go big, there's bigger benefits. You go small, there's more modest benefits. I think when you start to dig down a little bit deeper, it becomes a much more nuanced conversation. I think when we look kind of site by site and try and think about what are the constraints and what are the options and what's appropriate looking at a broad coastal region. I think when you add in our other ocean users, the need to invest in fishing resilience and infrastructure and other industries that we already have here but have been underinvested in for many, many years. When you think about the innovation opportunities and the research opportunities with institutions like Cal Poly, I think there's an opportunity to put all these different pieces together and figure out a landing zone that the community writ large can be comfortable with. That'll take a lot of hard work. That'll take a lot of dialogue. Conversations like this are just a very small part of the work that needs to be done. But I think there is an opportunity for the Central Coast to look at all these different options. Again, offshore wind being part of that broader basket, and come to a place where we can articulate what that local interest is. And I think work constructively with industry and with our state and federal partners to hopefully get to that point.
you for that. And before I move on to our next question, I do want to remind people, if you have a note card, please write a question down. One of our reporters, Stephanie Zapelli, you can wave it around in the sky for a little bit, and one of our reporters will come and grab it from you. And then we'll have time for that. So hopefully somebody can come and grab those. And then I kind of want to bounce ahead. Jennifer, we've been talking a lot about the impacts of the ports and so forth. I'm curious, is the port construction process completely in the hands of the state? Is there local control over this? What kind of boundaries do we have there over what happens?
No, it's not in the hands of the state. Just to reiterate from what we talked about earlier. If at some point, hypothetically, the state were to dictate, this is gonna go here, 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 that will be a surprise to me. I suppose, I'm not a fortune teller. Could that happen hypothetically? Do I think it's gonna happen? I personally don't think so. But like I said, I'm not a fortune teller. But what I can maybe share is that from my perspective, if I do a good job with this planning and my colleagues and I as a team do a good job with this planning, is to provide a framework, a roadmap, and sort of a logical sort of blueprint that could assist local entities, local operators who are interested in redeveloping or expanding or somehow with making their waterfront facility available for this purpose, that it would help them obtain money to do so. I do believe that the industry is going to have some skin in this game in terms of helping waterfronts get ready. But I also know there's lots of money out there already. So that's not a hypothetical. There are monies being allocated to this purpose, public money. And so how does the state facilitate success at the local level so that if there was an interested location that could point to this report and say, see, we're in this study as a feasible, practical, low environmental impact area, and that's why we should get this grant or whatever. So it's like I would hope that it would be a mutual relationship more than the heavy hand of the state coming down and dictating to the locals what they must do. So that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it. And so, Senator Laird, jumping back to you, I understand that there's a lot of environmental concerns when it comes to constructing anything in our water, nonetheless ports and so forth. So I'm curious if you can explain what existing state, maybe federal policies that exist that can help protect our environment while these ports may be constructed.
Well, there's, at the state level and at the federal level, there's each an environmental process that sort of requires consideration of a project, have the possible problems identified, see if you can address those problems. At the state level, it's known as CEQA. At the federal level, it's known as FEMA. And the thing that's significant about both is that they require public participation, and they put people at the table. And one of the biggest debates in Sacramento right now is whether or not to try to reform this law. And there are some real concerns that, because there are some abuses, but if you reform it, that you're not screening out the people, and you're not screening out the ability to look at the problems. And I think one of the fears, and I've heard it from some people that have written or called, there's a bill going through right now by Senator McGuire, who is from Sonoma County, and who represents the area that would support the Humboldt offshore wind turbines. and he wants a streamlined permit process. And there are those of us that have said, as he moves this bill through, you've got to make sure local governments and everybody still has a seat at the table and still is involved. And one of the things in the negotiation of the Diablo Canyon extension last fall is that the administration wanted to override environmental processes and how that was done. And the compromise at the end was that the Coastal Commission would still have their full authority, which would allow or require public participation, but it would be time limited as opposed to being unlimited. So there would still be the complete requirement for public participation for vetting it, but you couldn't take 3 or 4 years to do it. You could have it limited so that it tried to serve both purposes. You could have it timely enough for when the decisions needed to be made, but you would keep everybody that's legally supposed to be at the table with the authority that they legally have now to act on it. And to me, if they're looking at streamlining things, that would be what makes sense. And as I mentioned earlier, I know the mayor is here. She has written and said, we want to see at the table. We want to make sure that we are at least kept informed. And I think the difficulty right now is we don't know what the table is because the project hasn't fully been elucidated. But we know that some of us are committed to make sure that people will be at the table and how the project will go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. So Josh, I wanted to ask you, Diablo Canyon has been mentioned a few times tonight. And of course, it might be on a lot of people's minds because the NRC was in Slow County last night, talking about the relicensing proposal and so forth. And so I'm curious when it comes to translating jobs from Diablo Canyon to potentially the offshore wind industry, what's the timeline on that? Is there a timeline to help people secure their families here, keep their families here, while also having high-paying jobs?
Sure, yeah, so really good question, Mackenzie, because I think as we think about the energy transition, which the state is trying to manage, right, and making sure there's not shortfalls, and the grid continues to operate, there's of course the parallel economic transition that's causing. And I think when we think about that, I almost take a step back because this isn't something new that's going to happen in a couple of years. This is already happening today and has happened for a number of years now, right? We've had power plants in our community shut down. We've had refineries and other energy assets closed down or slated for closure. Obviously, Diablo Canyon is an important and critical employer, and those are really good paying jobs. And that's a big gap that you have to try and make up over the coming years. But I think from our perspective, we have to take an all-of-the-above approach, right? We have to make sure there are pathways and opportunities for folks that lost their job or are looking right now for an opportunity, so that folks working in a place like Diablo Canyon can see a pathway and have the predictability that they could continue to live here and stay here and find a good paying job going 5-10 years into the future. And kids growing up here, right? See a pathway for themselves, 15-20 plus years down the line that they could stay here, afford to live here, and find a good paying job. And so energy transition, I think, is critical for this region just because of the acute impacts that we've already seen and absolutely will see in the coming years. And again, I think offshore wind is part of that broader conversation as to how we might address those challenges.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm working on reading through your questions. Some of these are like really fantastic questions. And I'm hoping we can have enough time to answer these. There's kind of one last question that I want to ask Jennifer and Senator Laird, and Josh, you can chime in. The date 2030 has been thrown around a lot for goals of getting turbines in the ocean. That is like very close, it seems. And so I'm wondering, does port development need to happen before that? What kind of timeline, like is that an accurate timeline of when we can actually get turbines in the water, or what are we looking at here?
Well, I know Jennifer's going to speak to a piece of this as well, but it has generally been thought that if everything went well, or there wasn't a delay, you could get turbines in and start to produce power in 2030. And in the negotiations last year for Diablo Canyon, the key thing that exists here is that you need transmission for the wind. And it takes a while to site it. One of the biggest concerns about offshore wind is the Humboldt site. It is in the middle of nowhere grid-wise. They do not have anywhere near the transmission to take that power and move it. And it's a big concern about how that would happen and whether it could be done. And there's lots of discussions about whether to run the cables down the ocean floor and bring it to San Francisco Bay Area or somewhere, but even there they'd have to do it. But here, there's the transmission that exists out of Diablo Canyon that matches very closely what would be needed. So when we were negotiating the Diablo deal, there were times when the administration wanted it to be more limited or 10 years, and we really limited it to 5 years from 2025, so that transmission at Diablo would be available at the time the wind might come on. And so there are lots of, while maybe others can speak about the different factors that would lead to whether 2030 works or not on offshore wind, there was a real factor in the transmission in the negotiation of the Diablo deal to have that available at the time that there might be power.
I'm glad Senator Laird talked about transmission because of the universe of things that I'm worried about. I don't generally have to worry about that because I got 9 of them problems in transmission, not one. Do I think that it's technically feasible? Probably, to get something without port upgrades. And this is, speaking from very much not my expertise, just from, reading the materials that have been developed by our engineering contractor. They could be towed from a port that could do, does have a capacity, but it would be a farther tow, which slows down the rate of deployment. We heard, that there's potentially a way to integrate from floating vessels, but I don't know how widespread that's believed to be possible among industry people. My guess is that if this really kind of goes forward in the way that is currently envisioned in the state and federal goals, is it would kind of start slow and kind of be this rolling output or sort of staggered implementation, because you're sort of dealing with a less than ideal sort of port situation first, so you can't put as many out there in as fast of a pace, and then as port facilities became operational, then that sort of unit per time could accelerate. And again, all of this is hypothetical. We haven't done really, we're still so much in the planning phase, even though it seems like 2030 is like really right on top of us. So that's why I'm worried all the time. But yeah, that's kind of my idea on that, is it would just be slow at first, while the other things are catching up.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so with audience questions, I'm going to try to kind of combine some sentiments that I'm seeing here that are common threads. And so obviously we're sitting here in Morro Bay, we talked a lot about how there could be a port built in Morro Bay, the Morro Bay estuary, which is an extremely sensitive ecosystem, and already the maintenance needed for the Morro Bay T-Pier has been a complicated issue, and so forth, and the issue of dredging is already something that impacts our ecosystem there. And so I'm wondering how we're going to address these very, very localized impacts that we have on our Morro Bay estuary, on our dredging here, on the businesses that already exist along that waterfront. How will those issues be addressed throughout this process? Can people have a voice in this whatsoever, to ensure that maybe if their business is located along Key Pier or along the Embarcadero, that they are able to at least have a voice in this process?
Of course, those issues have to be addressed, and they may even be significant enough that it doesn't make sense to have the port there. And there are, and, you know, I have gone to see them. When I was at the climate conference fall before last, I went to see the floating turbines off of Aberdeen, Scotland. And a month ago, I went to see the turbines off of Denmark, and they're different. The Denmark are fixed to the floor. The turbines in Scotland float. And I finally got it. It was really hard for me to understand. When I first heard it, that they have underground platforms, the water pressure stabilizes them, they have cables that go down to the ocean floor and come in with the power. It works. But what I saw is I saw the ports at each place. And in Aberdeen, they just have this thriving business community that is all around it. But they had an existing port that seemed to be significant enough that you were not having new environmental impacts. And it was a similar thing where it was in Denmark. And it was so ironic because no matter where you are in the world, you cannot be away from the internet. So I'm in Denmark the night before I'm going to see the turbines, and I get an email with a memo from the Moral Bay Fishing Association with 23 concerns about wildlife. And so I had the memo printed out, and the next morning when we met with the Danish people, I said, here are their concerns, let me read some of them to you. And it was very interesting because they said we have done science to address some of the wildlife concerns. There are some things that are very different from how deep it is off of California and how far it is with wildlife. That then raises some concerns about fishing boats and where they might be and how they might be, and you will have to look at this a little differently in California because the facts are a little different, but they addressed it. And I have a feeling there are certain places that they decided not to do things because of the impacts. And so I think all these questions tied together, because the question about whether people want to see at the table was important. And they're going to have to. And in Denmark, in particular, that country has 5.6 million people. It was a real jobs issue. In Scotland, they have the North Sea oil. And when I was there, I met with the Scottish environmental minister, or whoever it was, and he says, we are literally going to leave oil in the ground and transition away from oil and get to a point, and we're close now, that we have 100% renewable with what we're doing and the windmills and other things. And so all these things fit together. How businesses work, how the transition works, how you make sure people have a seat at the table, how you do your best to mitigate whatever you can. And into the California coast, that I'm really familiar with it, there are just some places that are so environmentally sensitive that there's things you just can't do in it, and representing an area that goes from the Santa Barbara County line to the elephant seals in Indian Nuevo, that just exists in certain places all the way down the district. And you know, we have done our best to protect some and try to still have economic activity that integrates everybody and works. And it is a very hard set of decisions to make, but that's what's going to happen.
Awesome, that was fantastic. Unfortunately, we are already over time. And I know that there are a lot of unanswered questions here that I wasn't able to get to from my own list and also from the list that was provided from the audience questions. And so I really want to stress that this is probably the first event that we will hold, but not the last. And so as this process moves forward, I want to ensure that community members are brought in front of officials, like the ones we have here today, to ask questions, more questions as this process moves forward and so forth. So I will, this live stream of the event will be available on our website and on YouTube, I believe, as well. And then we'll also have an article hopefully answering more of these questions that you guys asked here. And feel free to email me, you can reach out to me, it's Shuman@thetribunenews.com. If you have any questions and so forth, and I will do my best to cover those. Always a subscription to the Tribune helps pay those expenses. So we'd appreciate if you could subscribe. Just gotta do that plug right there. But thank you everyone for showing up tonight. I know that there's a lot of unanswered questions that you'll probably still have, but please stay tuned and hopefully we'll get those answered as things move on.
I have a really crucial question.